At 72 years old, my life had settled into a rhythm I trusted. I woke up early, not because I had to, but because my body no longer believed in sleeping late. Mornings were quiet, often spent with a cup of coffee and the soft hum of the world waking up outside my window. I had learned to appreciate slow moments. After a lifetime of working, raising a family, and chasing deadlines, I finally felt I had earned the right to move at my own pace. Nothing felt urgent anymore, and I believed that was a blessing. I wasn't chasing big dreams. I wasn't planning some grand adventure. My hopes were simple: good health, enough energy to enjoy my days, time with the people I loved. I measured happiness in ordinary things: a familiar song on the radio, a shared meal, a phone call that lasted longer than expected. At my age, you stop thinking in decades and start thinking in seasons. You assume the road ahead is shorter, but stable, predictable, safe. That's why the first sign that something was wrong didn't alarm me. It was just fatigue at first, a tiredness that lingered a little longer than usual. I told myself it was age doing what age does. Friends my age complained about aches and exhaustion all the time. I wasn't special. I didn't want to be special. I brushed it off, adjusted my routine, rested more, and kept moving forward. Then came the appointment. It was supposed to be routine. One of those visits you go to because you're responsible, not because you're worried. I remember sitting in the waiting room, flipping through an old magazine, noticing how uncomfortable the chairs were. I remember the smell: clean, sterile, almost cold. When the nurse called my name, I stood up slowly, joints protesting just enough to remind me of my years. Still, nothing in me suspected that this day would divide my life into before and after. The doctor was kind, calm, too calm, in hindsight. He spoke carefully, choosing his words like each one carried weight. When he said the word, cancer, it didn't hit me all at once. It hovered in the air, unreal, as if it belonged to someone else. I nodded, not because I understood, but because that's what you do when you're overwhelmed and don't want anyone to notice. I heard explanations, percentages, next steps, but they all blurred together. My mind kept circling back to one thought: at 72, why now? Walking out of that office felt strange. The world looked exactly the same, but I wasn't. Cars passed, people talked, the sky held its color, yet something inside me had shifted. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry, I didn't panic, I just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, staring ahead, trying to understand how life could change so completely without making a sound. Telling my family was harder than hearing the news myself. When you're older, people assume you're prepared for things like this. They think age makes you stronger, wiser, more accepting. The truth is, fear doesn't fade with time. It just becomes quieter, more private. I watched the concern spread across their faces, and suddenly I wasn't just carrying my own fear, I was carrying theirs too. I felt responsible for how they felt, even though none of this was my doing. The nights were the worst. Sleep became shallow and unreliable. I would wake up at odd hours, my mind filled with questions I had no answers for. I thought about time constantly: how much I had lived, how much might be left, how quickly everything could change. I thought about moments I had taken for granted, conversations I assumed I'd have again, tomorrows I had quietly promised myself. Cancer has a way of making the future feel fragile, like glass you're afraid to touch. As days passed, appointments replaced routines. Waiting rooms became familiar. Words like treatment and prognosis entered conversations I never wanted to have. Friends offered encouragement, and I appreciated it, but encouragement doesn't erase uncertainty. Everyone wanted to know how I was feeling, and I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't at peace either. I was suspended somewhere in between, learning how to carry a reality I never asked for. What surprised me most was how much my age shaped everything. Doctors spoke differently to me than they might have to someone younger. Conversations included phrases like, "at your stage of life," and "quality of remaining years." No one was unkind, but the message was clear: time mattered differently now. I realized that cancer at 72 isn't just a medical condition. It's a philosophical one. It forces you to confront questions you may have avoided your entire life. I began reflecting on the years behind me. The mistakes, the joys, the regrets I never fully resolved. I thought about how fast it all went. How one day I was busy building a life, and the next I was looking back at it. Cancer didn't just threaten my body, It held up a mirror and asked me to examine everything. Had I lived well? Had I loved enough? Had I been present, or just busy? There were moments of anger. Not loud anger, but quiet resentment. I had done what I was supposed to do. I worked hard. I tried to take care of myself. I stayed in my lane. And still, this happened. It felt unfair in a way that words can't fully capture. At 72, you don't expect life to throw you a curveball, you expect it to let you coast. Slowly, though, something else emerged beneath the fear. A strange clarity. When time feels uncertain, priorities sharpen. Small problems lost their importance. Old grudges felt heavy and unnecessary. I found myself caring less about what didn't matter and more about what did. That shift didn't remove the fear, but it softened it. It gave it context. I realized that this diagnosis wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. I hadn't reached any decisions yet, not about treatment, not about next steps, but I could feel something forming inside me. A need to be honest with myself about what I wanted from the rest of my life, however long that might be. I knew the road ahead would ask more of me than I had expected at this age. And I also knew that whatever came next, I didn't want to face it blindly. This was only the beginning. I didn't yet understand how deeply this moment would reshape my thinking, my values, and the way I saw each passing day. But standing there, on the edge of uncertainty, one truth was already clear. Cancer had arrived uninvited at 72, and whether I liked it or not, I was going to have to decide how to meet it. After the diagnosis settled in, life no longer moved the way it used to. Time stretched and folded in strange ways. Some days felt endless, weighed down by appointments and waiting, while others passed in a blur I could barely remember. My calendar, once filled with ordinary plans, now revolved around doctor's visits, test results, and conversations I never imagined having at this stage of life. I wasn't sick enough to feel truly ill, yet I wasn't healthy enough to feel normal. I existed in an uncomfortable middle space, unsure of who I was becoming. The doctors began laying out my options. They spoke carefully, respectfully, and with experience. There were treatments that aimed to fight aggressively, treatments that focused on slowing things down, and options that leaned more toward comfort and monitoring. Each came with its own list of risks, side effects, and expectations. I listened closely, asked questions, took notes, and nodded along. On the surface, I was calm and cooperative. Inside, I was overwhelmed. Every option felt like a door, and behind each door was a version of my future I couldn't fully see. What made it harder was knowing that my age changed the conversation. At 72, the body doesn't recover the way it once did. Treatments that might be manageable at 50 could be devastating now. Doctors didn't hide that from me, and I appreciated their honesty. Still, it left me feeling exposed, as though my years were suddenly a liability instead of a lifetime of experience. I wasn't just choosing how to treat cancer, I was choosing how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice in the process. Family meant well, but their fear showed in different ways. Some wanted me to fight with everything available, no matter the cost. Others worried about my strength, my comfort, and my peace. I could see the worry in their eyes even when they tried to hide it. Every suggestion, every question, came from love, but love can be heavy when you're already carrying so much. I felt pulled in different directions, not wanting to disappoint anyone, yet knowing that this decision could not belong to anyone but me. There were moments when I felt guilty for even hesitating. People reminded me that medicine had advanced, that survival was possible, that giving up wasn't an option. But I wasn't talking about giving up. I was talking about understanding. About acknowledging the reality of my body, my age, and my values. Fighting isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's choosing thoughtfully instead of reacting out of fear. Fear, however, was still very much present. It showed up unexpectedly, in the middle of conversations. While watching television, while standing in line at the grocery store. Suddenly I'd be aware of my breathing, my heartbeat, the fragile fact that all of it could change. I thought about death more than I ever had before. Not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one. What would it be like? Would it hurt? Would I be afraid when the time came? These thoughts didn't mean I was ready to leave life behind, they meant I was trying to understand it more honestly. At night, my mind was relentless. Sleep came in fragments. I replayed conversations with doctors, imagined outcomes I couldn't control, and questioned decisions I hadn't even made yet. I wondered if choosing treatment meant losing myself slowly, or if refusing it meant losing time I could have cherished. Every path seemed to demand a sacrifice, and I didn't know which sacrifice was the right one. I also began to notice how differently people treated me once they knew. Some spoke more gently, as if I were fragile glass. Others avoided the topic entirely, afraid of saying the wrong thing. A few surprised me by being completely honest, asking questions that were uncomfortable but real. I appreciated those conversations the most. They reminded me that I was still me, not just a diagnosis, not just a number on a chart. As weeks passed, I paid closer attention to my body. Every ache felt suspicious. Every good day felt borrowed. I learned how quickly the mind can turn sensations into stories, and how exhausting that can be. Yet in those moments of hyper-awareness, I also felt strangely alive. I noticed textures, sounds, and emotions more intensely. Cancer had narrowed my focus, stripping away distractions and leaving only what was right in front of me. I began reflecting deeply on what living meant to me now. Was it measured in months or moments? In medical success or personal peace? I thought about people I had known who went through long treatments, and others who chose differently. There was no single story, no universal right answer. Each journey was shaped by personality, values, and circumstance. I realized that comparing myself to anyone else was useless. This path was mine alone. There were days when I leaned toward treatment, imagining more time, more memories, more chances to say what needed to be said. And there were days when I leaned away, imagining freedom from constant medical intervention, freedom to live without being defined by appointments and side effects. My mind went back and forth, sometimes within the same hour. The uncertainty was draining, but it was also necessary. I was learning to sit with difficult questions instead of rushing toward easy answers. One afternoon, after another long discussion with a doctor, I went for a walk. Nothing dramatic, just a slow walk through familiar streets. I noticed how ordinary everything was. Children playing, a dog pulling its owner along, leaves shifting in the breeze. Life was happening all around me, completely unaware of the storm inside my head. That contrast struck me deeply. The world hadn't paused for my diagnosis, and maybe it didn't need to. Maybe I could still step into it, even with all this uncertainty. That walk didn't give me answers, but it gave me perspective. I realized that no decision would eliminate fear entirely. No treatment would guarantee time, and no refusal would guarantee peace. What mattered wasn't finding a perfect choice, it was finding an honest one. A choice that aligned with who I was, not who I felt pressured to be. As the days continued, something subtle began to change. The panic softened, the questions remained, but they felt less sharp. I started listening more closely to my instincts, not just the voices around me. I paid attention to what gave me calm and what filled me with dread. Slowly, without forcing it, I could feel a turning point approaching. I didn't know yet what decision I would make, but I knew it wouldn't come from fear alone. Cancer had taken away my sense of certainty, but it had given me something else in return, a rare opportunity to choose deliberately. At 72, with more years behind me than ahead, that choice carried a weight I could no longer ignore. And somewhere in that weight, I began to sense the outline of a decision that would change not just how I faced cancer, but how I lived the rest of my life. There came a moment when all the noise finally quieted. Not all at once, and not easily, but gradually, like a room settling after a door is closed. I stopped asking everyone else what they thought I should do and began asking myself questions I had avoided. Honest questions, uncomfortable ones, questions that didn't have anything to do with statistics or medical charts, but everything to do with how I wanted to live. At 72, I no longer had the luxury of pretending time was endless. Every choice felt heavier because it mattered more. I began spending more time alone, not out of sadness, but out of necessity. I needed space to think without influence, without expectations pressing in from all sides. In those quiet hours, I looked back over my life in a way I never had before. I thought about the years I spent working, the sacrifices I made, the moments I rushed through because I believed there would always be more time later. I realized how often I postponed joy, telling myself I'd slow down someday. Now someday had arrived, and it was asking me to be intentional. I asked myself what I feared most. Was it dying, or was it suffering? Was it losing time, or losing myself? The answers surprised me. Death itself didn't terrify me the way I expected it to. What frightened me was the idea of existing without truly living, of being alive in name only, tethered to machines, appointments, and exhaustion. I didn't want my final chapter to be written entirely in hospital hallways. At the same time, I wasn't ready to disappear. I still loved waking up in my own bed. I still enjoyed conversations that drifted without purpose. I still felt warmth when I laughed, and peace when I sat quietly with my thoughts. Life still held meaning for me, and that mattered. This wasn't about choosing life or death, it was about choosing how to live while I was still here. I revisited the treatment options with a different mindset. This time, I wasn't looking for promises. I was looking for alignment. I listened carefully to what each path would likely demand of me, physically, emotionally, mentally. I imagined myself living inside each option, not just surviving it. One path felt heavy, filled with struggle and uncertainty that would consume my remaining energy. Another felt calmer, less aggressive, more focused on balance and comfort. The more I sat with it, the clearer my feelings became. There was resistance, both internal and external. Part of me worried about judgment, about being seen as weak, or reckless, or irresponsible. Society praises fighting, no matter the cost. We're taught that strength means endurance, that giving everything you have is always the right answer. But I had lived long enough to know that strength takes many forms. Sometimes strength is knowing when to push, and sometimes it's knowing when not to. I had difficult conversations with my family. Conversations filled with pauses, emotion, and honesty. I told them my fears, not just about dying, but about living in a way that didn't feel like mine. Some understood immediately, others needed time. There were tears, there was silence, but there was also respect. I reminded them, and myself, that this was my body, my time, my life. Love doesn't mean control, it means listening. The night I made my decision was quiet and unremarkable on the surface. No dramatic moment, no sudden revelation. I was sitting alone, thinking about nothing in particular, when a deep sense of calm settled over me. Not relief, calm, the kind that comes when you stop arguing with yourself. I knew then what I needed to do. The decision wasn't driven by fear or denial. It was driven by clarity. I chose a path that prioritized quality of life. A path that respected my age, my limits, and my values. I chose to live intentionally, even if that meant accepting uncertainty. It wasn't about refusing care or giving up hope, it was about defining hope on my own terms. Hope for peace, hope for presence, hope for days that still felt like mine. Telling my doctors was easier than I expected. They didn't pressure me, they didn't judge me, they listened, and in that moment, I felt empowered in a way I hadn't since the diagnosis. I wasn't just a patient anymore, I was a participant in my own life. I had reclaimed my voice. After the decision, something shifted inside me. The anxiety didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip. I stopped waking up with dread. I stopped measuring every day against an imagined future. Instead, I focused on what was real and reachable. I planned small things. I enjoyed ordinary moments without guilt. I let go of the need to justify my choice to anyone who didn't understand. There were still doubts. There always are. But doubt no longer controlled me. I learned that certainty is overrated, especially when it comes at the cost of peace. What mattered was that my decision felt honest. It reflected the man I had become after 72 years of living, learning, loving, and letting go. Cancer didn't make the decision for me. It forced me to face it. And in doing so, it gave me something unexpected, a chance to choose deliberately, to live the remainder of my life with intention instead of habit. I didn't know exactly how much time I had left. None of us ever really do. But I knew how I wanted to spend it. That decision didn't mark the end of my story. It marked a turning point. From that moment on, life wasn't about waiting for outcomes or fearing what might come next. It was about being present, about honoring each day as it arrived. And for the first time since hearing the word cancer, I felt something close to peace. After I made the decision, life didn't suddenly become easy, but it became clearer. The constant tension I had been carrying in my chest loosened, and for the first time in months, I felt grounded in my own body again. I stopped waking up each day bracing myself for bad news. Instead, I woke up asking a simpler question: what do I want to do with today? That question changed everything. My days became slower, but fuller. I paid attention to how I felt instead of how I was supposed to feel. Some mornings I had energy, and I used it without saving it for later. Other days I rested without guilt. I learned that listening to my body wasn't weakness, it was wisdom earned through time. At 72,